So good morning. I started working on women and economic issues literally decades ago. I won't tell you how many. But when I very first started working on what has now come to be known in international policy as women's economic empowerment, it was in 2006, just after I moved to take the job at Oxford. And at that time, I began my work by doing field work in the most remote villages in the most poor countries in the world, researching ideas that could possibly free them economically and allow them to be more independent, more autonomous, and ultimately freer by being able to earn for themselves. At the time, there weren't very many of us doing this kind of work at all. There was no term like women's economic empowerment. The few of us who were out there didn't know each other. And so from that perspective, I felt like I was alone, and the way people acted at Oxford, my male colleagues acted like I was alone because I was crazy. So it was a very big deal then when that same year, the World Economic Forum issued their first global gender gap report. And they opened up with an argument that was, at the time, quite shocking. They said, basically, that gender equality is tied to growth, and the rich nations, the high-income nations, have gender equality, or relatively more gender inequality, and the poorer nations have less. And so, therefore, what the poor nations should do and what the international development community should do is to help those poorer nations reach gender equality because it would increase their GDP. Now, basically what that meant then was they were proposing a schematic that looks something like this. So the y-axis here is GDP per capita. The x-axis is really any Women's Economic Empowerment Index, the WEFs or anyone else. All right, and it implies then that you would have a relationship that was a positive relationship. Is this going to work? I don't think all right, I'm just going to wave. Okay, which is what I usually do anyway, and I'll have to run over here and wave to you guys too. All right, so wait a minute. Back. There we go. All right, so then this pattern here is telling you that there's a positive relationship. That is, as I just said, that the more empowered the women are, the higher the GDP is. Nobody had ever put these variables together before at that time, and it kind of seems obvious maybe to us now. At the time, it was completely counterintuitive, completely off the wall, to many people totally implausible. And so what the economists and the finance types said was, hey, this is just correlation. This is not causality, which I have since learned is what economists say when they want to think about it. Okay, so they're saying basically nothing here to see, so don't look, right? Problem was you didn't have to look very far to see right away that at the top of these graphs you had countries like Sweden and Norway and Finland and Luxembourg, who were not only wealthy, but had really taken leadership in terms of, very early on, making provisions for gender equality. And at the bottom, what you had were countries like Yemen and Chad and Ethiopia, who were not only known for having pretty miserable conditions for women and were poor, they were all also, nearly all of them, at war. So then the objection came along, well, rich countries can afford to set their women free. Poor countries must focus on survival, so their men have to be dominant. Now, mind you, there was absolutely no evidence at that time that having dominant men helped your survival chances. And now we know actually very solidly that excessive male dominance jeopardizes human survival because it so often leads to conflict. But this is what people wanted to think, because they didn't want to think women were important. All right, and so the implied causality here then ran from a direction that was from GDP to gender equality and not the reverse. So rich nations could have it and poor could not. And, oh, by the way, rich countries should leave the cultural preferences of poor countries alone. It's none of their business. Okay, so I'll walk over here a little bit got cameras here. I don't usually work with two, so I'm a little bit awkward here. Okay, so the thing is that it really was like, it was so fascinating. And if you looked further than just at the whole sweep upward here, what you also found was that these were countries who were not only rich, they were democratic, they were stable, they were educated, they were healthy, and they were secular and liberal with a small L. Whereas at the bottom here, these countries were not only poor and conflict zones, but they had runaway fertility, food insecurity, fragile or autocratic states. They were disease-ridden. They were poorly educated. They were religious in the way of a religion that sort of dominates, infiltrates the government and tries to run every, not just spiritual, but bossy religion. All right, and they had a particular kind of rather ancient masculinity, all right, that tends to be violent, tends to be very volatile, wants to use women as power pawns, very, very quick to respond violently to any kind of a challenge. And over time, there were several scales that were devised to measure this kind of really very masculinity, and it turned out that it tracked very closely with the Human Development Index, all right, which is the index that the United Nations Human Development Program uses to measure progress for human well-being. All right, so this was enough for people to start to get interested, and I suddenly had a lot of colleagues around the world. It was really growing, and there was this massive research effort that began and is now still very much going on, but it really blew into something between 2006 and 2020. All right, and this huge body of literature grew up, and now we can say quite firmly that the causality has been established. All right, this is a large cross-disciplinary literature. There are not only economists, there are geologists, there are anthropologists, there are sociologists, many, many, many different disciplines. It's a very large literature, especially if it's a short amount of time. They've been able to identify the steps from point A to point B. So in other words, gender equality towards health and well-being, right? Not just that they're associated, but how that happens, okay? And the mechanisms that make that happen, that propel that process, have been identified. We have tested a number of programs for interventions to try to solve the problems. I've tested a number of them myself because I continue to do that kind of field experiment work for the next, 20 years. Nothing to look at there. Okay, and we now know for sure that the direction runs from gender equality to health, wealth, and peace. Now I'm going to say that in a different way. Pay attention. It means that it's not that the rich countries could afford to free their women. It's that freeing their women made them rich. Right? Okay. But the flip side is also true, that gender inequality actually is very harmful. In fact, I will go so far to say it's toxic. It's like the whole world has been drinking motor oil. It's really bad for us. Now, I'm wanting to, because I know all this is kind of, are you kidding? I do want to point you to a thing for USAID commissioned me to write, actually, though my name is not on it, because USAID's name is on it. It's called Gender Inequality Causes Poverty. You can Google it, it's easily accessible. And what it does is it goes through the details of what I just said and talks about what the steps are, what the correlations are, but it's very readable and it's only 10 pages. So if you want to be able to talk to people about this over cocktails and know what you're talking about, go there. All right, so we're now able to translate this then into economic terms. And we can say up here, all right, that we have a more efficient use of resources, and that's the main reason that drives the growth. We're not wasting so much. Competitiveness and productivity as a result are higher, are better. We have reduced costs. So for example, domestic violence costs nations an average of 5% of GDP. That's a really large number, all right? And it's directly related to actually not just gender inequality, but economic gender inequality. So if you can get rid of that, that's a lot of money that could go to something more productive. All right, better human capital. This is something that was really interesting to discover, that it's not only getting money and getting women to earn money, but making sure they have the ability and the authority to decide how it's spent, because they spend it in more pro-social ways, and in particular, they spend it on the cultivation of children. All right, and better human capital is just an economist's way of saying healthy, educated, strong population. It's the most important resource that a modern economy can have. Okay, and down here, we can say, first of all, that this stuff, this awful stuff, just constantly destroys resources. It's a very destructive way to live. There is a huge amount of waste, and so there's a negative effect on productivity. There are very high costs, not only violence, infant mortality, adolescent fertility, all carry high costs, and they have poor human capital. All right, but it's not just, as we've kind of gone on with this, it's not just the economics that's important about this. It's also the humanitarian issues. In fact, I would say at this point, it's more the humanitarian issues. We have more violence of all kinds in these kinds of economies. We have forced marriage. We have children out of school, chronic hunger, selective malnutrition, which is to say that women and girls are fed so much less that they start to show poor cognitive development, stunted bone growth. It's very, very dangerous birth defects. Disease, trafficking. You may or may not be aware that 70% of the world's slaves are female. And war, which comes out of this other sort of more negative masculinity. Okay, but on the top side, it's not all, happiness and flowers, okay? Because we still have unequal employment, we still have unresponsive governments, we still have lack of access to capital and credit for women. Low fertility is becoming a really big deal, and that is definitely a gender inequality issue. Violence against women is still really bad. In fact, you would be surprised how bad it is in some of the Scandinavian countries, for example. Resistant masculinity, I'll talk to you a little bit in a minute, but it's basically, in these countries, it has become by far the norm for men to support gender equality. In fact, it's really pretty prevalent around the world for men to be pro-gender equality. But there's a movement that comes up sometimes from other men that don't like it and push back. And those people make a lot of trouble. And I'll talk about that in a minute. Resurgent religious and right-wing movements that are aimed at women very often in their initial stages. And a fear of backsliding and war. And I would say this is particularly of concern to me in Eastern Europe, so I'm going to talk a little bit to that. Okay, so a global pattern had emerged. First of all, there is no nation in the world, none, that has reached gender equality, not a single one. There's a distinct pattern of disadvantage that is the same no matter what country you look at. Even if the size of the variable is a little bit different, the pattern is always the same. The mechanisms that hold these disadvantages together are also the same. But we have found that we can intervene against the mechanisms and reverse the consequences, reverse the process. This is definitely something that can be fixed. That is the most hopeful message I hope you take out of this, and also the book that I've written, is that we can do this. We can totally do this. All right? No country can say that their gender inequality setup is their culture. All right? That one is just a loser. We're not going to take that one anymore. You can no longer say that because the pattern is the same everywhere. And the patterns are not random, they're not chosen by women, and they are not natural. They're structural factors that have negative consequences everywhere. Yeah, I'm sorry? I can't hear you. Continue. Okay, yeah, because I'm running a little over. Okay, I'll just keep going. All right, so here's an example. This is the percentage of land in 106 countries owned by men. That's the black dots versus women. That's the red dots. You can see just at a glance that 80% of the world's land is owned by men. All right, and about 18.7% is owned by women. You can't seriously look at this picture and call it a random pattern, right? And there's no way. And in fact, you also really couldn't say, oh, not really, you couldn't say, oh, they all chose not to have the most important source of capital in world history that is as bigoted as it is implausible. But what it is instead is that it's a structural thing. We can go back to the very first legal codes 4,000 years ago show that women were excluded from land ownership that early. And it has been all over the world the case that land could only pass from one man to another. And it's a very, very rare circumstance that a woman comes into the ownership of land. You can see, let me just point out to you that you see these two black dots at the bottom. One of those is Iran and the other one is the Netherlands. Okay, and in fact, all across that axis right there, what you're going to find is a mix of very conservative Middle Eastern countries and allegedly liberal Western European countries. The blue dot is Britain. I'll tell you a little, I'm going to say first. You see these two, this little 4 dots right there in the middle? That's Lithuania and Latvia. It's amazing. It's amazing. And I've been trying to, I asked Biba the other day, why? I've looked at this. I've tried to figure it out. Why did this happen? Anybody that knows, if you come talk to me while you're here, it'd be great. All right, because this is historic. It's a big deal. All right, however, I do have to caution you that one of the things that we have learned doing this is that women's gains are temporary. Okay, throughout history, there have been periods much longer than our own where women have gained rights and then lost them again. Okay, so one thing we can say is that even these probably will be temporary. I hope not, but in world history, that's how it is. There's a very strong pull back into gender inequality. So that blue one is in the United Kingdom. It's that way because the aristocracy in Britain still controls 35% of the land, and they still practice primogeniture, okay? I mean, does that sound medieval? Probably because it is, right? And not only that, but you have to be a member of that class to be part of the House of Lords, which is the largest parliamentary body in the world, which means that they have had maybe enough women in that body you could maybe count them on one hand. Really, really, there's no excuse for a modern democracy to be operating like that. Just very quickly, this is just a graph, though, of the whole European region grouped differently, 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th century. All right, this was the tall ones are the men owning, and the short ones are the women owning. So basically, it is unchanged in the 21st century from the 9th century. That's how long it takes to knock these dudes down. Okay, so here's another graph that shows you in a different way the pattern of inequality. This is equal pay. It's wage equality for similar work, same and similar work. And it's 132 countries. And the blue bar at the top is equality with men. And what you can see here at a glance is that there is not a single country in the world, not one, where women are paid the same. And if you looked at any other measure of economic engagement, like control over capital, small business ownership, you would find the same pattern. All right, and this is not something that is due to merit. It is due to prejudice. This is enrollment in higher education. I just did this, so I don't know why it's 2020. I just made this graph. But anyway, okay. Enrollment in tertiary education. The red bar is equality with men, so that you can see around the world at this point, women in higher education are more educated than the men. Okay, and in fact, you would be surprised that most of those really high ones there are Middle Eastern countries. All right, and this is where we see waste very well exemplarized, is that these countries are putting money into educating their women, all right? And then they're throwing them out. They're making them all go home when they have babies, right? And it's just money down the drain. It's very inefficient. Very quickly, and we can say that in more detail later, the usual objection here is that, well, women study, but they study the wrong thing because they don't do STEM. So let me just tell you, and maybe you're going to ask me later, is that it's not true. It's just flatly not true. Propaganda. I'm serious. Okay, so what we see here then is an example of where we see our system being enforced. The dark red countries here are the countries where motherhood penalties explain most of the gender difference. Right? And you can see it's exactly the opposite pattern to what raw gender equality would be. The lighter countries would normally be where gender inequality is very high. All right, but here what you're seeing is the degree to which the motherhood penalty is policing and holding gender inequality into place. And I'm sure you can see that there's a very familiar pattern here, and that Eastern Europe is one of the worst places. Okay, and this is a world fertility map. You see something there? You think those might be related, right? We have a system where the more developed countries are just eating themselves alive by not providing childcare for working mothers. And they just won't stop doing it. It's going to be an economic train wreck. So the cost of unequal pay is that it retards growth, it creates waste, it produces low fertility, which will become, in the next 10 years, I would say, an economic train wreck. It's a penalty that accrues to households and not just individual women, and so it affects the resources available to children. And it undermines democracy by violating basic rights and creating a lack of faith in the government. Why? The method of equal pay enforcement was doomed from the beginning. In the 70s, in the West, people set up the enforcement to be on individual women's shoulders, where they had to take the money to hire a lawyer and to enforce their own rights. Governments have lacked the will, and there are studies on this. It's not about blaming the businesses. Yes, they're at fault, but it's really the governments who will not enforce their own equality laws. A lot of myths about the fact that saying that, well, pay discrimination is imagined and not enough people have access to the real facts. Resistant males. I'm mindful of running out of time, so I just want to say, we have a problem that we're not recognizing, and that is that there are men in all organizations who are opposed to gender equality and will sabotage a diversity initiative, okay, and will dampen even conversation about gender equality. And we keep trying to fix the women, right, or fix the policy, and we are never going to fix this problem if we don't fix those men, okay, or do something with them. Right? And it's important to remember they are a very small minority. No, they're holding all the rest of us back, all of us. So what to do? Invest in childcare as economic infrastructure, which it would be. Hold government accountable for enforcing the equality laws. Change the method of enforcement, probably to some kind of executive branch enforcement, just like you do for taxes and things. Put shame in pay discrimination. In my country, people are paid inequitably, but they're at least ashamed of it. I have to say, in the United Kingdom, there's no shame in it, and I couldn't believe that. We need to focus attention on the men who are resisting and see what we can do about that, because you cannot solve a problem you will not face. And I wanted to talk about fertility, but I've run out of time, so maybe later. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, you want me back here?
No, you still stay here for a second, though we're a little bit late, that's okay.
Yes, we are, sorry.
No, I had the feeling, looking at many of her faces, that she could have gone on for another half hour easily, right?
Thank you. Thank you.
And of course, the summit's challenge is eternal. It is how do you get as little or as many points of view and knowledge, on the
Yes.
table. Now, what we were unable to do was to get a whole lot of Linda's books here on time. So please order them online. It's either the Double X Economy or The Cost of Sexism, right? Yeah,
Yep.
that was it, yeah.
Yep.
Same book, different titles.
Yeah.
And many of you, I'm sure, are interested in the material, and you can Google Linda or Google any of these topics, and I promise you that there's a lot to learn and a lot to use in simple factual dialogue. But having looked at all this, I have one question.
Okay.
We in Northern Europe, thus the Nordic countries, Baltic countries, Germany, maybe Poland, all believe that we're different and more advanced, at least in terms of gender diversity in many areas. Now, having seen this, are we just kidding ourselves?
Well, we're all kidding ourselves on this. So let's be really clear. We think we have it all handled in the United States too, and we are so kidding ourselves. But I do think actually the record is pretty good compared to the rest of the world. I do. And actually that the situation in Latvia actually compares quite well to the rest of Northern Europe. I was very impressed. I did a lot of reading about the childcare situation, the government plans and initiatives in Latvia. And it's quite, I think, well thought out. I'm sure it's going to take a while because this is building infrastructure, and that takes a long time. But it's a much more forward-looking, much more clear-eyed vision, and I think it'll work if it gets done. I do.
And on this positive note, the good news is it's similar in Lithuania and Estonia as well. So Linda will be with us a little bit longer. Please have a seat and a round of applause before the next session.
Thank you.